and welcome to The Bottom Line, where we break down the most pressing business and economic issues of today. And today we are focusing on Hungary. Now, as we have seen in one of our features, the country is running a high deficit, which is unlikely to go down right before the parliamentary elections in 2026. And now joining me to discuss these issues, Raffaella Tenconi, Chief Economist at Wood & Company. Hello, madam, and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
So now, the Hungarian economy contracted by 0.9% last year, but the European Commission predicts to rebound with growth of 2.4% this year and 3.5% next year. So how do you view these projections, and what factors, in fact, now are driving this anticipated recovery?
Yeah, we agree that there is going to be a recovery this year. I mean, Q1 was already showing, a positive expansion of 1.7%. The first factor that is helping the recovery is that household consumption was heavily contracting last year because of the big hit in purchasing power terms, and it's now stabilizing, it's even mildly expanding. So that is a positive influence that you have this year. And the other part is in terms of, Hungary is a big exporter. There was a big rundown of inventories that has been taking place. So that has kind of bottomed. So it's not detracting from GDP. So overall, we do think the economy will expand 2.5% this year and 2.5% next year. We are somewhat more cautious on the outlook for next year because we don't see the industrial sector in Europe yet restarting, and Hungary being a big exporter, it's going to be vulnerable if the export segment is not improving.
And now, speaking of GDP, I want to tackle another problem here. Hungary's budget deficit now was 6.7% of GDP last year, and your company now says that it will probably reach 6.5% of GDP this year, and that's the prediction. So the government is introducing now measures like defense fund where foreign companies contribute. So how severe really is now Hungary's fiscal situation?
Well, first of all, I would have to say that currently, in my view, the fiscal position of Hungary is weak because of a policy decision, because of a strategic decision of the prime minister. Because we have seen that since 2010, Hungary had greatly improved its budget management, and it was a combination of genuine domestic improvement and external constraint to force it to be more prudent. But essentially, since 2019, we've seen a return of the pre-2010 era. So budget deficits are very, very loose, even when the economy absolutely didn't need any more stimulus. So we think that currently the government chooses to keep a large budget deficit because it's building up momentum into the 2026 general elections, and we've seen in the June European elections that indeed the opposition is stronger than what it was in the past. So we think that tightening the budget right now is not exactly what the government is trying to do. What we see them doing in the last few weeks is to signal to the market that they're aware of the situation, that on the margin there is a desire to mitigate the shortfall. But most importantly, they're putting incentive on banks to make sure that they buy more bonds, they buy more longer-term bonds, so that their funding is secure.
So do you think that the situation might change now after these elections of 2026?
Yeah, we've seen the Orbán administration, as soon as they win an important general elections, the moment after, they can tighten fiscal policy very aggressively when they want to. So yes, my base case is that fiscal tightening will be serious only after the election in 2026.
And now I wonder, now let's move on perhaps to some diplomatic missions that we've seen of Viktor Orbán. And now Prime Minister Orbán conducted some so-called peace offensive, if I may say so, recently with visits to Russia and China. So, of course, Orbán must have known that he'll be condemned for this. So the question is, why did he do it? I mean, in recent years, numerous Chinese companies, of course, also invested in Hungary. So how do you see this situation panning out?
Well, first of all, I would say it's very much his style. His style of management, and increasingly it's also his style in foreign policy. He wants to show that although Hungary is a relatively small country within the EU, it has its way of approaching issues. It's proactive in providing solutions. And Orbán's position has been that there needs to be a ceasefire as soon as possible, that funding Ukraine, it's actually counterproductive. So it's very much coherent with what he has consistently said. It's not in line with the EU protocol, but again, I think actually is increasingly showing that he tries to disregard EU protocol for as long as he is allowed to.
So Lee, you mentioned also this disregard for the EU protocol, which probably means that he wants to get something out of the relationship with China. So my question is, much more do you think that now Viktor Orbán can expect to be getting from China?
So when you look at foreign direct investment, Chinese investment in Hungary has become the most active component of FDI. But it's still very small relative to what the EU and the US put into Hungary every year. So I think he definitely wants to diversify funding for the economy as a whole, and he's achieving that. He's trying to diversify funding for the budget as well. So he's tapping the Asia market and the Chinese market. But again, we're talking about small sizes relative to the US and the EU. And he has made a big bet that electric vehicle production is where Hungary can have a comparative advantage within the EU. So he's building up productive capacity in there. So I think what he is trying to achieve is to make sure he's not dependent on any one country, and he can try to somewhat play one country against each other when, he perceives the constraint to be too tight.
Now, do you think that he can now perhaps, now looking at this, let's zoom out for a moment. Having in mind that now Viktor Orbán, of course, is now maintaining these ties both with Russia and China. Now, we've seen in the past and also in the present, for instance, now with the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, that when things are going bad in their country and domestically, then they turned to foreign policies and perhaps economic policies, to foreign policies in order to mend the situation. Do you think that perhaps now this is what Orbán might be doing and using now the economic issues for his perhaps now for his gain? Do you see that this way, or would you explain it another way?
No, I would explain it another way. I would say what he's really trying to achieve is to show that Hungary, again, as I said, although it's a relatively small and newer member of the EU, it can really provide creative solutions to the EU. They're not the ones that that Germany and France normally put forward. And he has the EU presidency, so I think he's betting on a victory of President Trump in the US, which would give momentum to a ceasefire. So he would like to go down in history as being the member state in the EU that has kind of signaled the solution and navigated that solution. So the first reason why he's doing it is pride, I would say.
And now speaking of course, about domestic issues too, now Hungarian businesses are also turning to migrant labor due to worker shortages, and yet the government still, we do see that has a very restrictive immigration policy. So how can this contradiction be reconciled, and could this become a contentious issue for Orbán perhaps?
So the statistics show that foreign labor is increasingly operating in Hungary, and it's not just Ukrainians, which have been present in Hungary even before the war. but it's also increasingly Asian workers. So there is a practical solution that he's offering, even though the rhetoric, as you said, is very much anti-immigration. Although if you notice, the position is that they're anti-illegal immigration. They're not necessarily completely anti-immigration. But yes, there is a contradiction between rhetoric and action is actually delivering more labor because they keep on expanding productive capacity and they're running out of workers. What I see is more of a domestic political issue is that, of course, this contention with the EU has made Hungary the only member state that does not have the recovery fund and also has part of the EU cohesion fund suspended. So he has to scale back on public investment. And for example, in the rural areas, irrigation investment is very much needed. Grid investment is very much needed. And that's where the EU money can make a huge difference. So he has not been able to do that, or he hasn't been unwilling to do that in the last few years, and has fueled a certain resentment of that electorate. And certainly it's part of the reason why the opposition is much stronger lately than what it has been in the last few years.
Thank you so much for this conversation. That was Raffaella Tenconi, Chief Economist at Wood & Company. Thank you so much, madam.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
And thank you so much for joining us here at The Bottom Line. So make sure to stay tuned for more tomorrow at 5 p.m. CET. But do not go away, as now coming right up, World Talks with Alia Koshuk from Belarusian National Revival. Stay tuned for that. I'm Alexandra Marhevich. Goodbye. Okay. All right. I hope that we hear each other.
Hello?
Hello. I hope that we hear each other. Okay, great. So now my question, off air but still on air, would be that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz now is set to visit Serbia to sign a contract for lithium exports to the EU. So do you think that it means perhaps new investments in Serbia? How do you see this situation panning out?
Yeah, definitely. I think Serbia has been increasingly working and improving its productive capacity, especially in batteries recently. It's part of the EU framework to try to bring closer to home critical materials and battery capacity. So I think it fits two key goals of the EU, both friendshoring and shortening the supply chains, as well as expanding the candidate countries' pool, so to speak.
Thank you so much for your expert insights. It's very invaluable and we'll definitely use this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Good evening.